Okay, time to get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you for joining us today for this conversation about universal basic income and guaranteed income programs. My name is Nikki Thompson, and I'm the campaign manager for the Maryland Fair Funding Coalition, which is a statewide coalition of 25 plus organizations that are all aiming to raise revenue with progressive tax policy in order to make sure that our state can make critical investments in essential services and in education. I've got a great panel here for you, but I'm just going to give a little bit more information about why we're here and what we're going to be talking about. For those of you who are first-time learners about universal basic income, this is the webinar for you. So there has been significant conversation in recent months about the benefits of direct cash payments to help ensure that families can afford the basics. There were universal basic income concepts discussed in the Democratic presidential primary and in the economic stimulus checks that were part of the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has helped illustrate some of the benefits and the challenges of income supports and its bipartisan support as well. So again, we've got a really great experienced panel for our conversation today about existing universal basic income program models and how Maryland can explore implementing some form of direct cash assistance statewide. So joining us today, we have Delegate Gabriel Acevero of the Maryland General Assembly, District 39. We have Matt Bruenig of the People's Policy Project. Sebastian Johnson, writer and philanthropic strategist. Madeline Naley for the Economic Security Project. And finally, Benjamin Orr from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy as the executive director. So I'm going to start the conversation off by asking each of the panelists some questions, but we also want to hear from you all who are joining us in the webinar or on Facebook Live. So you can ask us your questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on Zoom or in the comments if you're joining by Facebook. So to get us started, the first question is actually going to go to Sebastian. You did a TEDx talk titled "The Case for Universal Basic Income," where you explained why UBI should be embraced by more policymakers in the US. For folks who aren't familiar, what is universal basic income or guaranteed income?
Great, thanks, Nikki. So I think there are a number of policies that fit under the umbrella of what we think about as universal basic income. In the purest sense, universal basic income is a guaranteed amount of money that each citizen will receive from the government. So that can look like a lot of different things. And so it could be a monthly check that everyone receives each month. It could be what others call kind of the negative income tax, which is if you're not making up to a certain amount, or if you don't receive a high enough income, you're receiving a check from the government. And so the EITC has some elements of a guaranteed income in it, being a version of the negative income tax. It could be a payment from a sovereign wealth fund or from the state where you're getting a dividend from state-owned resources. So in Alaska, there's a permanent fund for oil and gas royalties that each citizen gets a dividend from. But at the end of the day, it's about guaranteed money, no strings attached from the government for every citizen. And it's an idea that has a really long pedigree in our country, actually. So the closest we ever came to passing a universal basic income in this country was actually under President Nixon, and after some studies in the late 60s, early 70s. It was an idea that was embraced by Martin Luther King. And going back to the founding of the country, it was something that Thomas Paine wrote about in his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, talking about the need for governments to ensure economic freedom as well as political freedom. And I think that ultimately what we're seeing in this moment of increasing inequality, but also creeping authoritarianism, is that there really is a connection between economic well-being and economic freedom and self-government and the ability of citizens to participate fully in their economic system. And so I'm happy to be a part of this conversation today because I do think it really gets to the crux of some of our debates.
Thanks, Sebastian. That was a great overview, full of facts that I didn't even know about how UBI started. So thank you for schooling me. But you mentioned economic freedom. How much does it take to get there? How much should be given on a monthly basis to meet basic needs? And how is that amount determined?
That's a great follow-up question. I guess that's like the $6 billion question of like, how do we both pay for this and how much are we giving everyone? And part of that, discomfort that people have comes from the fact that our traditional welfare and public safety net programs are means tested. And so the idea of sending a huge amount of money to people, does it disincentivize them from working? Will they still show up to jobs? I think my overall answer to that is that it should be enough money to really address the scope of the problem that we have in this country. And, particularly when you look at the pandemic, when you look at, our private service sector economy based on folks working in the service industry, that's about 70% of our non-farm employment. And so the shock that we're seeing to our economic system right now is like a huge calamity. This is massive. Normally recessions start in either the financial sector or other sectors of the economy, but to have it hit what is really the bread and butter of our economy means we have a massive problem. And folks were already unable to, cover a $400 emergency in this country. And so, a lot of the things that are on the table are enough to get people up to the poverty line. But I do think that, and so the poverty line at the federal level is about $12,000. And so most people, or many of the proposals that have come out have posited $1,000 a month for every adult. But we're going to need additional resources just to make up for the massive job losses we're seeing and the reduction in economic output. There's a bill moving in the House now, the Emergency Money to the People Act, that would provide $2,000 for every adult. The HEROES Act is calling for another single payment of $1,200. And so I do think that all of the different cash transfer numbers that are being thrown out are good, and we want to encourage that. But at the end of the day, we need to be thinking about how we structure this policy in a way that meets the actual need of families.
Thank you,
Sebastian. Sebastian's talking about the federal House, not the Maryland House of Delegates, where Delegate Acevero sits.
Yes, the Maryland House of Delegates is out of session. If anybody had any questions about that, thank you, Ben, for that.
And I just posted a side-by-side comparison of the bills that are in the House and the Senate on guaranteed income or money through the pandemic. Most of them are tied to an economic trigger. So it would be through the pandemic and some time thereafter while we stabilize.
Thank you. That's a great resource. And if you don't have it in the chat, or you're scurrying to try to find it in the chat, or something's going on with your chat, don't worry. We will make sure that you get that resource at the end of the webinar as well. So that leads me to next question. So now I'd like to ask Matt to talk about a related aspect, social wealth funds. You proposed in a policy paper the establishment of the American Solidarity Fund, a federal level social wealth fund. And for folks who aren't familiar, what is a social wealth fund and how is it related to the idea of universal basic income?
Social wealth fund is a pool of assets that are owned publicly, and the return on those assets are used for a social purpose. So you can kind of think about a mutual fund or a hedge fund almost, though without the negative connotations. But instead of having it owned by a small group of very affluent people who have all their money in the fund, it would be owned by everyone in society. And one of the ways you could use the return on that fund is to provide a basic dividend to everyone. And as Sebastian noted earlier, Alaska already has a program like this. They have around $60 billion in a collective fund. It was established in the 80s. Every year, they pay out a dividend to every Alaskan in that fund, from that fund. In most years, it's about $1,000, maybe $1,500, but that's per person. So if you're a family of four, $4,000, $6,000, a pretty significant amount of money. And you could do that federally as well. I proposed, basically to have the government use taxes on affluent people, wealth taxes, things of that sort, taxes on companies, in order to generate.
Breaking up a little bit there, Matt. You might want to repeat what you just said over again because you broke up a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, so the idea is to create this fund that is collectively owned, fill it up with assets that are taken essentially through taxes, levies on corporations, that sort of thing, to pay out a dividend. And I would note that current response to the crisis, if we really wanted to, I know Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had proposed language in one of the bills to try to do something like this. But if we're going to be giving out trillions of dollars to large companies at this point, one thing we could do is say, well, in exchange, why don't you give us equity in your company? That is, after all, what a private investor would ask for if they were giving them that kind of money. So we had an opportunity here to really build it up very cheaply. The stock market was way down, as everyone remembers. So you could have really made some headway in that. Now it's come back up, and we've not benefited at all from that publicly, unfortunately. So yeah, this would have been a good time to do it. And we are, I would say, slightly doing it a little bit, because if you look at what the Federal Reserve is doing, they're buying a bunch of corporate bonds right now. And those corporate bonds will generate returns, and those returns will be handed off to the Treasury to do, whatever the Treasury wants with them. So a little bit reasonable than I think it might seem at first glance.
Thank you, Matt. And you mentioned a local example. And so naturally, I think it's good that we pivot to what that could possibly look like here in Maryland. So Delegate Acevero, you've introduced UBI legislation during your first and second legislative sessions. Neither have managed to make it to the governor's desk, however. Can you tell us a little bit more about those bills? What's the likelihood of its passage, especially given the current context of COVID-19 and the impact that's had on Marylanders?
Yeah, sure. So my first legislative session, which was in 2019, I introduced legislation. I worked with a number of organizations and individuals, Matt included, to put together a piece of legislation that would have established first the Maryland People's Fund, which would have been a social wealth fund as described by Matt. And the Maryland's People's Fund would, in essence, be overseen and administered by our state's treasurer, and that in this case, that would be Treasurer Nancy Kopp, who would be responsible for overseeing this fund and for administering it. And what the legislation called for was a portion of the revenue from medical cannabis. For folks who aren't familiar, medical cannabis is legal in the state of Maryland, that a portion of those proceeds be placed into the Maryland People's Fund, the social wealth fund. And our state treasurer, who, as part of his or their responsibilities as the treasurer of Maryland, is to invest and to oversee not just bonds, but our state's investments. And so the state treasurer would be responsible for not just investing this revenue from medical cannabis, but then ensuring that the proceeds from those investments, that we're paying out a citizen or basic dividend on a monthly basis to Marylanders in our state. And so one of the things that we also wanted to address as well is not just the income inequality, but also focusing on low-income Marylanders, particularly those communities that are hardest hit, whether it's in the Rust Belt counties in our state, or whether it's those that are living in more urban parts of our state. there are a lot of people that are hurting, and the idea was to focus on those low-income people. And as we're building out the program, as the name suggests, universal basic income, as we're building out the universality of that program, that we're ensuring that we're taking care of low-income people, working families, people who could really need, who could, really use that hand up and that extra cash assistance to meet basic needs. And so the first legislative session, there was a lot of debate around that. I wouldn't say that I got opposition from either side on the idea. As was mentioned earlier by Sebastian, this is an idea that has been embraced by folks both on the left as well as on the right. In fact, Alaska has its UBI program right now because the libertarian wing of the Republican Party was responsible for implementing that program. And then, we talk about Richard Nixon, who was also Republican, but then we look at figures like Dr. King and so many others within the Poor People's Campaign, and today on the left, who are also calling for universal basic income. So the good thing is that there wasn't a lot of opposition to it from either side, but certainly a lot of educating, particularly around what is a social wealth fund, what role does it play, what do we mean when we say universal, what constitutes basic, how, what income is determined as enough in order for people to meet their basic needs in our state. And so ultimately the legislation did not come out of committee, but we decided to regroup, and it's a coalition of a number of organizations that advocate for children, youth, and families, to homeless Marylanders, people experiencing homelessness, low income families, organizations that advocate on behalf of these groups. Building that coalition, we decided to rework the legislation. And so this legislative session, it looked just slightly different. What we were calling for in this bill, this legislative session, was the establishment of a committee with representation from a number of folks in our state, from state agencies like the Department of Labor and the Department of Human Services, that would be the agencies that would in essence implement this if it were to pass, right? The Department of Human Services do a lot of work and social services and assisting vulnerable folks in our state. And so it was a legislation that called for the establishment of a committee with state agencies, with organized labor, with the University of Maryland School of Social Work and a number of other stakeholders to, in essence, figure out how we can implement a universal basic income program here in Maryland. And it was loosely similar to legislation passed in Hawaii, but a couple of tweaks in that, the makeup of that committee, the timeline, the sunset date in terms of reporting back to the General Assembly. And so it was a really good piece of legislation that we were trying to push, and the hope was to build out a program with the input of a number of stakeholders. Unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, we had to adjourn earlier than expected. And so a lot of bills, my bill on universal basic income included, pretty much died. And so we would then have to reintroduce it. But I would say that there is certainly a lot of interest, there's a lot of support, but there's still a lot of education that needs to happen so that folks understand what we mean when we say universal basic income or guaranteed income. What do we mean when we say social wealth funds, right? Because I talk about establishing the Maryland People's Fund, right, through this legislation, but not a lot of people would understand that correlation between the two, right? And so that's why Matt explained it really well, the role of social wealth funds in a guaranteed income program. And so we're hopeful that in the future, this bill will get some traction, but we are asking folks, especially when we're looking at the kind of economic impact that COVID-19 is having on working families and working poor folks in our state, that we really advocate for a program that, such as UBI, that is really not, I don't see it as welfare policy, but more so as insurance policy, right? When we see pandemics, when we see a downturn in the economy, universal basic income is insurance policy to ensure that, working families are able to meet their basic needs, are able to stay afloat, right? And in essence, still contribute, right? And so we're optimistic, but we're asking folks to stay engaged in terms of the legislative strategy. But I think COVID-19 and this presidential campaign has certainly changed the conversation around universal basic income. I think more and more folks are not just becoming aware, but are supportive of the idea. And I think that's going to change the way this legislation moves in future sessions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Delegate Acevero. And thank you for all the work that all of our panelists so far that you're doing on this important issue. So the delegate mentioned there are different models. So Madeline, can you talk to us about some of the models that are out there that Maryland could look to, especially if they start this process of trying to implement and figure out what UBI in Maryland could look like?
Sure. So I would say that other than Alaska, there is no statewide program. I work at the Economic Security Project, and we have funded and supported a couple of pilot programs. So I'm going to talk about the Stockton Economic Empowerment Development Program, SEED, out in Stockton, California, as well as the Magnolia Mothers Trust in Jackson, Mississippi. And I want to start there in Jackson because I'm hearing a lot about how guaranteed income or UBI has been around in dialogue. It's been on the right, it's been on the left, but who we're leaving out of this conversation is Black women that have been arguing for this for a long time. So we have not mentioned Johnny Tillman. We have not talked about the National Welfare Rights Organization. I apologize. So I want to think about that, about how important it is that we elevate the voices of folks who have been really marginalized and targeted in attacks on welfare, the idea of the welfare queen, right? And the racist, sexist attacks on that. So Magnolia Mothers Trust, what is it? It is giving the first year $1,000 to single Black moms in public housing in Jackson, Mississippi. $1,000 a month, no questions asked for 1 year. And these are, again, some of the most vulnerable folks in our society, the women who earn less than men, Black women who earn less than white women, right? And giving them the money and following what happens when they are given that breathing room and that space. In the first year, 20 moms paid down $10,000 of predatory debt. They stopped having to rely on predatory debt to make ends meet. They were able to spend more time with their kids. They were able to finish a GED. They were able to go on and get an AA. They were able to visit a family member in another state who was dying. They were able to do the things that so many of us take for granted. And so that was an amazing contribution that these women were able to make because they were given a little bit of economic flexibility. On top of that, we get to shift the narrative, right? We get to take this idea of, all of the horrible language that's been used of the takers, of the parasites. And instead we get to talk about how these are human beings in economic precarity. And when they are given a basic foundation, what they can do with their lives is what all of us want to do with our lives. Support our families, take care of ourselves, support our children, follow our dreams, follow our passions. So that's one project. Again, it was 20 mothers the first year, and it just launched again the second year with 75 moms in March. They made the announcement, and then weeks later, we were struck with a pandemic. So watching what these moms will be able to do as they navigate through this public health and economic crisis that we're all facing is going to be really important and amazing. The other program is the Stockton Economic Empowerment Development Program, SEED, out in Stockton, California. This was an 18-month study. It's going to wrap in July of this year. Funding 130 families with $500 a month. So as Sebastian was talking about, what is a basic income? What is, how do we provide that? So $500 in Stockton, California, it's not going to pay for all of your needs, but it's going to provide a bit more of a floor beneath you. And the reason that there are different amounts given depends a lot on other safety net programs. So in Stockton, there was still eligibility that you could get other safety net programs if needed. Whereas in Mississippi, because of the state requirements and so forth, you weren't. So those moms that got $1,000 a month on average actually saw 600 because they lost other benefits, right? And so there's a trade-off there. In Stockton, the folks were given $500 a month. It's going to last for 18 months. And again, we're seeing huge outcomes in family health. So this program also has a study that's run independently, following and tracking what's happening. And it's studying what's happening to folks' mental and physical health and seeing really big improvements in that. One of the fathers in the program said he learned his kids knew how to swim because he no longer had to work 3 jobs. So he got to be able to be there and spend time with his family. So you can learn more about these. I will make sure I think somebody's posting all sorts of stuff, but I can send out links to both of them. So in Stockton, the program is going to wrap in July. We're looking to extend it because quite honestly, we've built such strong relationships with these families. To think about leaving them without this floor during the pandemic and economic fallout seems unimaginable. So we're hoping to extend it. Then there have been task forces. There was a great one in Chicago. There's one in an unnamed southern city. I will let you know as soon as it's public. That'll be rolled out soon. Newark, New Jersey is about to release their report, looking at what it would mean for these cities to implement a guaranteed income or universal basic income. One of the things I wanted to mention on this as well, on this call, is we often talk about the money going to citizens, but one of the problems that we saw with the CARES Act is that it excluded I-10 filers. It excluded people who contribute to our society and contribute to our economy and contribute to America, and it purposefully left them out. So I would just caution us to think about the language that we use, and when we want to be inclusive, and think about, do we want a basic income for everyone who makes our country run? And do we want to ensure that everybody who is bringing wealth and creating wealth through their labor benefits in our social welfare funds, or do we want to be exclusionary? So that is something I would urge us to think about. Finally, I would say that we are running a campaign right now called Emergency Money to the People. And that's really working to get bigger, long-lasting, reoccurring payments through the federal stimulus packages. And one of the things that we think should be happening is that folks at the local and state level should really be pushing for a guaranteed basic income through this crisis, however we want to define it, however long this is going to last, because we know that states can't create money. They have to balance their budgets. Cities, the ability to borrow money is severely limited. And when states and cities face budget crises, what usually happens is attacks on our social safety nets, or those are where the cuts are, right? So a federal guaranteed income will allow families the support they need to rely less on those strained social safety nets that we are all going to see. In addition, when you have money in your pocket and Main Street opens up again, that's where you're going to spend it. So this will actually generate revenue, again, back in the cities and states, which will help given the budget crisis. So I'm going to post a link to a fact sheet that we have created. And I think my contact information is available, but really thinking about how we can organize our elected officials at the local, state level to push for this and call for federal guaranteed income as a way of supporting our residents and supporting our cities and states.
Thank you. So that just leads to, I guess, the next point, as you mentioned, and hopefully Ben is okay with kind of picking up from there. Advocates with a range of values and perspectives have called for a UBI, but kind of as already mentioned, they don't always agree on how it should fit into our larger economic security framework. So how do you see a UBI interacting with existing supports such as SNAP and Medicaid?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think as Madeline was speaking, I was thinking about how, and making the point about I-10 filers and others who were left out of the CARES Act, how the dividing line between the workers who are actually essential and the relative unessential nature of multimillionaires and billionaires in this country and in our economy is been made very stark. and who is essential includes a lot of I-10 filers. I think that when I think about UBI and the rest of our social safety net and the investments that we make to support our economy through our state residents and throughout the rest of the country too, really what I think about is the idea of supplementing, not supplanting these programs. I think one of the challenges we have, yes, this is a policy that has bipartisan support, but we do have to be cautious because there are many on the right who would like to see this as a way to get rid of other really effective programs like food nutrition assistance, like Medicaid, and decrease the overall amount of assistance that we give folks. So that's something we have to be careful about. With that said, I think one of the great thing about combining these is that we see there are certain things we know people need, right? We know people need housing. We know people need healthcare. We know people need food to survive and thrive in their daily lives. And so programs that are targeted towards those sorts of things make a lot of sense. But we also need to recognize that we don't know what everybody needs. We don't know the particulars of every single person's situation. We don't know the creative ways they might be able to figure out how to improve their family circumstances. And so giving direct cash payments and trusting folks to know what to do with it, and knowing the research shows that they'll turn around and spend that money in the local economy is really important, whether we're talking about the UBI or any other program that's structured like this, where it's cash that folks can use for whatever needs they have. I think it's vitally important. It is really important as we look at the wealth gap and how little savings most people, even most of us, have. Our ability to protect ourselves against emergencies, whether it's our car breaking down, et cetera. We need to give people the flexibility to respond to their circumstances in ways that are best for them and their families. So I think they're really complementary and can work well together when designed appropriately.
Thank you. So I'm going to shoot it over to Matt again. Many of the United States investments in economic security have become more restricted over time, with shifts towards time limits and rigid work requirements. Now, UBI takes essentially the opposite approach. What do you see as the advantages of unconditional cash payments?
Well, people have very complicated lives. That's what Benjamin was getting at. Some people have simple lives, but some people have very complicated lives. They might not have families that fit, obviously, into the way that we like to think about families. They might have extended families living with them. They might have one family member who, I grew up in Texas, who is on an oil rig 2 months out of the year and then is off for a month or 2 months or something like that. Seasonal workers are off for long periods of time. If they're people who pick fruit in the fields, the winter is maybe an off time if they're not migrating. It's very hard to necessarily put everyone in a single box and say, oh, this is how it works. You get up every day and you go to work 9 to 5 and you care for your, nuclear family with 2 kids and so on. That's not how it works for everyone. And so the nice thing about unconditional cash is, money spends the same no matter what. No matter your situation, you can always use that money to do what you need to do with it. And so the more freedom we give people and not try to think about putting them into one or another box or way of living life, you'll have more effect, especially on marginal people who don't necessarily live conventional 9 to 5 office job type ways that the people who frankly make most of this policy sort of conceptualize a good life. So that's one. And work requirements in all sorts of jobs for so what do you do about that? You might have disabilities that are somewhat difficult to document, and therefore you're not eligible for disability benefits, but you're still really not able to work, or maybe only able to work a little bit. So, you know, I'm not against programs that try to hit things for specific people, like people who lose their job, they should get unemployment benefits. You know, people who become disabled, they should get disability benefits. But we also have to recognize that there are all sorts of people who fall through the cracks because they, you know, the cracks are big and they don't fit into one bucket or another. And so having a universal payment can help take care of that.
Thank you. The cracks are big. The cracks are big. Does anybody else want to get in on this question? Because it's a lot that can be said about this particular question. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline something that Madeline mentioned about how people spend the money that's available to them. So we've known for a while that in a recession or in a depression, you want the government to be spending the dollars countercyclically. So government spending should go up. But the multiplier effect on each dollar that you spend in the economy isn't the same. And so part of what she's talking about is the idea that when you spend $1 of your income in the economy, that's going to support up to 15 service worker jobs. And that multiplier effect is really where you see economic growth and activity happening. And so when we're talking about the jobs that people have been let go of and the need for us to really revitalize our local economies, cash transfers have a really unique role to play in that. And so I really think that's an important point and something that resonates with a lot of small town America, people who are usually not on the side of expanding social safety net or welfare programs, but do really care about Main Street, do care about their local economies. That's something that is in our favor as advocates and that we should lean on.
Did anybody else want to add? Yes, go ahead, Madeline.
Thanks. So another thing I would say is, a lot of folks got the $1,200 stimulus check through the CARES Act. That money was spent in 1 to 2 weeks. It went on food, credit card debt, housing. The stimulus checks from 2001 and 2008 were spent over 6 months, and it went on buying new cars and new dishwashers, right? We are in a different situation. We are not at the place where you get $1,200 and you feel like, I'm good. I can buy, I'm getting a new dinette set, or do we have dinette sets anymore? But we're just not there, right? Folks need a foundation. They need a floor through which they can't fall. And we have the ability to provide it. To not do so is a moral failing.
And we've got time in case anybody else wanted to add in on that question before I moved on to the next one. Okay, great.
I would just emphasize what everybody else is saying, and it's particularly true when you're looking at state economies. When we're looking at Maryland and whether it's UBI or some other sort of assistance program, and we look at where the dollars flow, if we inject dollars at the bottom of our economy, they get spent in our state. If we inject dollars at the top of our economy, many of those dollars leave our state. And so, often there's this failed economic model out there of trickle-down economics. What I like to say is that money is not a liquid, it's a gas. You inject it at the bottom and it floats up to the rest of the economy and has that multiplier effect that Sebastian is talking about. So it's vitally important that that's where, if you really want to stimulate the economy, whether it's during a recession or any other time, you get the most bang for your buck by injecting it at the bottom or the middle of the economy and not at the top.
Thank you, everyone. So, Delegate Acevero, you have the last question. You were working on this issue well before the current economic crisis. So why do you think a monthly check to all Marylanders makes sense outside of an economic downturn?
Yeah, well, I think I think the data that we're looking at right now supports the case for that, right? You know, if we look at the studies after studies have shown that giving people cash as a way to address poverty works. And as Sebastian and Madeline and Benjamin had alluded to, people don't stop working because
we can still see you if you can't see us.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to make sure I get the 1 second here. All right, there we go. All right. Okay. Can y'all see me now?
We see you and we can hear you.
All right. So, but yeah, no, studies after studies show that, you know, giving people cash as a way to address poverty works. And I think the folks on this panel just really spoke to an important piece of that, which is that when people are given these direct cash assistance, they don't stop working and they don't squander it, right? But instead what they do is they use it to increase their earnings. They use it for basic needs. And in most cases, that money is spent locally and it's circulated in that local economy, right? So if we're making the economic argument here, clearly there's a case for universal basic income from an economic stimulus point of view. Now, if we look at the more rough and worrisome data where close to, you know, half of Americans cannot afford a $500 or more unexpected bill, right? That compounding with the fact that, you know, we have millions of Americans now unemployed and uninsured. We also have a lot of Americans who are economically insecure during this time, right? Who are relying on that unemployment insurance check or trying to find some kind of a way to earn a living or some kind of an income to provide for themselves or their families, right? And so in Maryland, we have over 500,000 people that are living in poverty. Since early 2000 to present, we have seen a 19% increase in poverty in our state, right? So we're looking at the economic insecurity of folks who cannot afford a $500 or more unexpected bill. We're looking at the issue of poverty in our state, and it's growing. You know, Maryland is one of the richest states in the union, and it's just so interesting to see this, you know, all this wealth, but yet so many folks who are also struggling, who we aren't responding to, who we aren't listening to and crafting public policy to take care of, right? And I think when we're looking at stuff like that, and then we look at studies that show that millions of the jobs that we see today and that folks have will be lost to automation in the coming years, that makes all of the data that I just mentioned even more scary, because how do we prepare for that, right? How do we retrain our workforce? How do we prepare for that level of unemployment and economic insecurity, right? And I think universal basic income or guaranteed income is one of those programs that ensures that we are getting direct cash assistance to people in need, so that they in turn can meet their basic needs. They in turn can increase their earnings, and they in turn can stimulate their local and our state's economy. And that's why it's so important here in the state of Maryland. And I think COVID-19 is showing just how much relief working families need in our state, right? Imagine if folks were getting $500 a month, right? Separate from the stimulus check, separate from unemployment insurance. If they were getting $500, every person over the age of 18 was getting $500 a month from the state of Maryland, no strings attached, to meet their basic needs. It will certainly change the situation that a lot of Marylanders are in right now, where they're desperate, where they're destitute. I get emails every single day, the most, 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 the the most moving of this entire pandemic was where a mother of four had sent me an email yesterday where the subject said, "No food, no money, please help." And that is the economic reality that COVID-19 has created that we are not responding to, right? And it seems to me that we are preoccupied with responding to the health crisis and not looking at the economic crisis that's been created as a result of COVID-19, right? And mind you, that economic crisis existed before the pandemic. I would argue that the pandemic made it worse because we had a lot of economically insecure people in our state and in our country. So we need to develop a program as a state to be able to help those in need, those in our Rust Belt counties, on the Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, those that live in more urban jurisdictions, those that live in Southern Maryland. We need to ensure that we're putting money back into the hands of people, because what we see is that it gives working families and poor people agency, right? It says that you matter, right? And that, we trust you. And I think in a society where we tend to, demonize poverty and demonize low-income people and stigmatize them, this is a way to tell people who have historically been seen as invisible that we see you, that you have agency, that we trust you, and that also you are valued. And that's really what universal basic income is about. It's saying that everyone is valued. And I think if we could set up something like that as a state, it would have a profound impact on the poverty rate. UBI is one of those, not the, but one of the most effective, anti-poverty programs that we can implement as a state and as a country. And I in no way want to discourage efforts at the federal level. I think we need a UBI program at the federal level, at the state level. I'd like to see it at the local level as well, the way other jurisdictions like the city of Jackson and Stockton have done it, and others are exploring it. We need to do that, because if we're serious about income inequality, as we say, and the more important issue, which is our democracy, then we have to deal with the growing income inequality in our state and in our country. Income inequality is a threat to our democracy, right? And so if we claim to care about democracy and we claim to care about strengthening our democracy, we have to ensure that we're centering working people, working poor folks in our public policy making, and UBI is a great way to do that. But it's not the only way, it's one of many policy prescriptions.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. We're gonna switch over a little bit, change up and switch over to the audience to get some questions from them for just a minute. So please start submitting your questions. You can use the Q&A box on Zoom or the comment section on Facebook. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I'm gonna take a little moderator's privilege and ask a question that I have. And it's a common question in Annapolis all the time. How are you going to pay for it? And as the campaign manager for the Fair Funding Coalition, that is my number one question all the time, because I feel that the Fair Funding Coalition has the answer. But I also want to pivot it over to Ben just to get your thoughts on that part of the discussion and how it does relate to our state's tax code. So how can we pay for a program like UBI here in Maryland?
Thanks, Nikki. So, I think so often what we hear is that we're in this sort of zero-sum game where programs are pitted against each other. In Maryland, when we're talking real numbers, that really means that education is pitted against healthcare because those are the two largest parts of our budget. But actually, we have the money to do all of these innovative things. We have the money to invest in the reform of our education system that we've been talking about in Annapolis for the past 3 years. We have the money to make our HBCUs whole and restore, make right the wrongs that the state has inflicted on them. We have the space in our economy to raise revenue to pay for something like a universal basic income. The problem is that our tax code is upside down. So, and this is true in a lot of states, not just in Maryland, but in Maryland, the particular features are such that those making more than $500,000 a year pay a smaller share of their income in state and local taxes than the rest of us. Many of Maryland's largest corporations pay almost little or no tax in the last 5 years, including Under Armour and Marriott. So we have to, as residents of the state, as policymakers in the state, do a better job of asking everyone to pay their fair share. And there are a couple of ways that we do that. The first is to really close the loopholes that have been placed in our tax code by big multi-state and multinational corporations and the very wealthy. By strengthening our income tax, we have a mildly progressive income tax, but it still asks a lot of those making very little, and does not ask very much of those at the top of our income spectrum. And Maryland is a very wealthy state. We have one of the highest median incomes in the country. We have, on a per capita basis, we have more multi-millionaires per capita than almost any other state in the union. Obviously, California and New York have more on a numbers basis, but on a per capita basis, Maryland is right up there. And so we need to strengthen our income tax. We need to modern our sales tax, which is really structured around this 1950s understanding of how our economy operates. And the legislature tried to do that in some fashion the last legislative session, and Governor Hogan vetoed a number of these proposals, actually, that we're talking about in the last couple of minutes. And including, I think, one of the most egregious things that we've done in the last few years, I think, is raising our estate tax so that it used to apply to the top 3% of the states in Maryland. Remember, we're one of the wealthiest states in the union. Now it only applies to less than 1% of estates in Maryland. And so even if all we did was restore the estate tax to its previous level, that would make a big difference in terms of our ability to pay for these sorts of things in ways that would, the tax policy would not harm our economy, and the UBI policy or whatever other, state investments we're going to make in our economy would help our economy. So I think, we can, and have, in various papers gotten into the weeds of what all that means. But when I'm really sort of at its core, those are the sort of 4 principles that are out there available to Maryland to support these sorts of people supporting investments and economy and supporting investments.
Well, thank you for indulging my question. We're going to go to some that have rolled in from the audience. So the first 2 questions are, I'll start with the first one, and anybody can answer. This is for anyone who has the answer. What do you think of Democracy Collaborative's recent proposal for the Local Economy Preservation Fund that would buy out distressed businesses and convert them to co-ops? Does anybody want to take that question?
I haven't had a chance to look at that policy paper. But
there's a link in the chat, so I'll make sure all the panelists get that, and we might be able to circle back to it at the end.
Yeah. But I do support worker-owned businesses and cooperatives. I think it's not enough for us to acknowledge the harm that capitalism exacts on not just our economy, but on working people and poor folks. We have to build an economy that shows that, look, we can build sustainable alternatives to capitalism. And I think cooperatives, worker-owned businesses are a good way to go, and I support them, but I haven't had a chance to dig into Democracy Collaborative's policy paper. But when I do, send me that email and I'll respond.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I haven't read that paper, but I know the person who wrote it, and I've chatted with him before, so I have a sense of what it probably contains. And, I think it's a good idea. I think it's important when we're thinking about co-ops versus businesses being owned through a social wealth fund or even a state-owned enterprise like U.S. Postal Service or things like that. It's useful to think about some businesses make more sense as co-ops, other businesses don't. So an obvious business that might make sense as a co-op is a smaller local business. I think there in Maryland, you have Red Emma's worker co-op bookstore. A bookstore, you know, that works fine. It's a small company. It wouldn't really make sense to try to, you know, own it through a big fund or something like that. But talking about American Airlines, that one maybe would make more sense to have owned through a social wealth fund, or talking about a postal service or a transit authority or something like that. That wouldn't necessarily make sense as a worker co-op. So, you know, that's a sort of broader point, but yeah, I mean, I think insofar as you have smaller businesses that are going to become distressed, you're going to have a ton of people who are retiring in the next few years who are business owners who don't have businesses they can really sell in a normal sense, like sell off to another company. They're just going to basically shut them down if they retire. That might make sense to create a fund to help those businesses remain by giving the owner a little bit of money in exchange for having them give the business to the workers, and so they can own it outright instead of just closing the business down and nobody gets anything, which is what the alternative would be for a lot of people who are retiring and about to close their small businesses. So, yeah, I don't know income, but you know, I think it's a decent idea.
Thanks, Matt. Does anybody else want to?
What was just said?
I was just going to say, so Sebastian, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No problem. I think there's some lag. It's fine. I just wanted to kind of highlight this notion that we talked about of economic freedom. Part of that is being secure in the resources that you have and being able to provide for your family. But I also think that what this question gets to is that economic freedom is also about your ability to operate within the labor market and in the economy, and also the ability to say no to a job that is something that you don't want. And so one of the things that we heard during the passage of the CARES Act is that if we give people who are receiving unemployment $600 a week, then they'll never go back to their job. And so it's a disincentive to work without asking the underlying question, what is the real disincentive to take a job? It's if the job doesn't pay well or if it's a horrible job. And so what we do really have is an economic system which favors the owners of capital, and it favors people who are offering jobs because the economic conditions that exist in the country are so dire for people that they have no option but to say yes to that job. And so when we think about the broader labor movement and the ability to support workers in truly being co-creators of wealth and value, that is another way in which universal basic income can contribute to an area that is tangential, but also really necessary if we want to talk about.
And Ben, did you want to add in as well? Thank you so much, panelists. You've answered already.
So yeah, three things, and it sounds like none of us have read the paper, so that's unless Madeline has. But I think the point about jobs is a good one in the sense that it's important as we have this conversation to not lose sight of the fact that UBI or other cash-based assistance should not be an excuse for giving up on the idea that we need good jobs, jobs that are sustaining and that are safe, and that people aren't putting their health at risk in order to put food on their table. So we have to pair whatever we do with good job protections and income, wage floors, et cetera. The second point I would say is, I think the larger point about worker collaboratives is, I think that quite often they do make a lot of sense. And I get Matt's point about different scales have different models that work better for them. Certainly, so the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, I'm the executive director. I created the organization back in 2013. We are a union shop. So I find myself unexpectedly on the management side, but it's a great model where the union and management can work together to figure out what's the best way to return to the office if we ever, when we return to the office, we're not working from there right now. How do we do that in a safe manner that everybody has a say in? And the third point or anecdote I would raise up is, I'm one of the cooperatives that I follow a little bit because I love to cook is King Arthur Flowers up in, I think it's Vermont. And they've got about 300 employees. I just randomly looked at their website to make sure I knew how big they were, but they're a worker-owned cooperative, and their business has exploded because everybody's home baking right now. But it's also one of the other interesting things that has come out of that model is that they collectively decided one of the things they're doing right now is they are making loans to the people and organizations that normally buy from them. So a lot of the small bakeries, et cetera, that normally buy in bulk from them, King Arthur Flour is actually pushing that money back out into the communities to make sure that those businesses exist when this all ends to continue to buy from King Arthur Flour. And that's pretty creative and really builds a sense of community in a way that might not have happened if it was owned by a single person or a corporate board. So I think that that doesn't mean every co-op looks like that, but I just think those are some interesting examples of how that can play out in this spectrum of what co-ops look like.
Nikki, I think you're on mute.
Am I still on mute? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
No one can hear me.
We can hear you now.
Hear me? Okay, awesome. So next question, how can we capitalize a social wealth fund in Maryland given the current budget crisis? How do we get from here to there?
Well, I think we could all tag team that, Matt, Ben, and myself. I'll let Matt start.
Well, so I don't know the specifics of Maryland too well. I know a tax on marijuana businesses was one of the ideas thrown out last time, which, sounds like a good idea to me. I don't know how much, you'll be able to capitalize a fund with that. But, in the states that have done it, what they've relied on is essentially natural resource wealth in one form or another. This is true in Alaska, of course, where they brought in the publicly owned lands, which happen to have a bunch of oil under them. And they just essentially move those into the fund. Anytime someone wants to take oil out of the ground, they have to pay the government. The government puts the money in the fund, holds on to it permanently. In other states like Texas, where they have these land grant colleges, I guess there are actually a lot of land grant colleges, but I'm from Texas, so I know this. They had a bunch of public land, and they just said, all right, that land, we're setting it aside. It'll be rented out, invested, whatever. And then the money from that is actually used to fund the University of Texas and Texas A&M. So it's a similar kind of idea there. Just grab some sort of piece of the natural world, which is valuable, and nobody creates that, right? Nobody makes land, nobody makes oil. It's just sort of there. Grab that, hold on to it, and use that resource to fill up a fund one way or another. What Maryland has that's comparable, I'm not so sure, so that might require some local expertise that
For the local experts.
Delegate Acevero, if you don't mind, I'll jump in next. So I think what Maryland has is our natural resources really are people. And what makes us a wealth generating state and what makes us attractive to business is our highly educated workforce and our, things that you can't move, our proximity to the federal government, our connections to the entire I-95 corridor and the markets that are contained within that corridor. And so if we invest in those things to make, such as education and healthcare and a clean environment that's available for everybody to enjoy, we maintain Maryland's status as a really attractive place to live and to work and to start a business. Then we have the resources within our state lines that we can tap. and we talked about those before. The tax breaks that we give multi-state corporations that we don't give to local businesses. We ought to close those and level the playing field for local business. We ought to say that the fact that we tax less than 1% of estates is frankly morally offensive, and in one of the wealthiest states in the union. And so, there are Maryland has a great amount of potential in terms of the revenue that it has to invest in itself. It just has to be willing to create the taxes that it needs in order to make those investments. And so that's what my argument is for how we pay for this.
Delegate Acevero, did you want to add any points?
I would agree with Matt and Ben. We really need to take a look at our state's regressive tax code, and I think we started that conversation with our education plans this session, but it needs to continue because education is not the only thing that we need to fund, that we're constitutionally obligated to fund. We need to ensure that we're funding other important social services and programs. Those are important programs that aren't necessarily enumerated in the Constitution as important, but they are equally as important. And we need to find the revenue in order to be able to pay for that. And I think where it starts is having that conversation about our state's tax code. And just what I've seen in Annapolis is just sort of like a shying away from that conversation because we feel like it gets into a conversation of class warfare. And in some respects, it is because when we talk about a tax system where people who earn more or generate more wealth are paying less in taxes and corporations are evading taxes, whereas working people, mom and pop, and these small businesses are paying and footing that bill, because when these folks don't pay their fair share, that's an absence from revenue that could be counted in to fund really important programs in our state budget. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what wealthy individuals in our state are paying. We need to have a serious conversation about our state's tax code, and we must stop accepting from elected leaders, whether it's our governor, whether it's those in the state legislature or those in Congress, that somehow if we demand that those who can and should be paying more pay more, that is going to adversely impact us and our state. I saw a question in the chat about, when Ben was talking about our state's tax code and folks paying their fair share, someone asked, well, how do you respond to, people saying, this wealth flight, right? You do that and, wealthy people will leave and whatnot. And thank you to Sebastian for posting studies that show that is completely false. But we need to have an honest conversation about who is paying what. And we also need to hold corporations accountable for the revenue, for the dollars that they owe to our state, right? Every single time they don't pay their fair share, that is one less dollar to our schools. That's one less dollar towards our HBCU settlement. That's one less dollar towards this universal basic income or guaranteed income program. And so it starts with our tax code, but I really want people to stop believing when some people try to tell them that the money isn't there, this scarcity argument that we don't have enough, that somehow if we do this big idea that helps a lot of people, that we're going to have to cut somewhere else. It's completely ridiculous. I sit on the Appropriations Committee. I see where we allocate funding. I see what we allocate funding on, and we have the money, right? We just have to have those courageous conversations and hold those elected officials accountable who continue to allow wealthy people to not pay their fair share and corporations to get away through loopholes. Then we can't have programs like universal basic income that we all agree is so impactful and life-changing.
Thank you so much. I mean, if you brought that question up, we can go into it. Oh, no, go ahead, Sebastian. The question's out there. It's loose. So if you want to grab it, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to, sorry, having a little bit of mic trouble. I just wanted to talk about what the flip side of what Gabe just addressed, the idea of wealth flight. So it's been made, like, so eloquently made the point, like our natural resource in Maryland is our human capital. It's the people who live and work in Maryland and who are attractive employees to a lot of the companies that want to relocate here. So we also have to think about, how does a universal basic income make our state more attractive for people who are looking to relocate? And how does that continue to have a virtuous cycle in terms of our development? And so you think about, for a lot of middle class families, childcare is an astronomical cost. They're paying as much per year for early childcare as they would for college tuition. And so if we're talking about a universal basic income program or a universal child credit program in our state, that's the kind of thing that people kind of look to think about, if I'm balancing my household, where do I want to be? And as those people flock to the state, that makes it more attractive for businesses to follow. They're following their customers, they're following employees. And so I do think that there are going to be elements of this where, higher taxes on the high end might make the state less attractive to those who want a low tax state and who don't want to pay their fair share. But we also have to think about the larger picture.
Yeah, and Nick, just to add one thing really quickly, and I think it's important to give people real examples, because we say all the time our state's tax code is regressive, folks need to be paying their fair share, and legislators need to ensure that wealthy people and corporations are paying their fair share. But I want to give specific examples where folks, can see and understand how, we respond to wealthy people and to corporations when they say certain things or when they need certain things, as opposed to when working people and poor folks say, we need this, right? So some folks on this webinar may know that Amazon, not too long ago, had put Maryland on a short list of states that it was interested in building its new HQ to. And we did not get any, there was no contract signed, there was nothing, there was no ink to dry. And all Amazon did was just expressed interest in our state, right? Put Maryland on a list with a number of other jurisdictions. And our state legislature, worked with our governor in order to put together an incentive package for Amazon to move to our state. And that incentive package in total came up to over $7 billion. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but it was roughly around $6 billion that the state legislature had put together an incentive package, and the governor had committed to another $1 billion in infrastructure spending, right? This is how our governments respond when wealthy individuals and corporations say, look, I just have an iota of interest in your state, right? That we can find billions of dollars, work together to find billions of dollars to give to this corporation, right, who has not materialized any six-figure paying job, right? In fact, the jobs that we're seeing that Amazon workers have in other states are either seasonal, low income, not with benefits, et cetera, right? And so despite not having any definitives, we were able to put together an incentive package to lure Amazon to our state. And I would argue that universal basic income or a guaranteed income program does not require a package that big, but we can certainly find the money in order to ensure that a social wealth fund like the Maryland People's Fund not only has the funds that it needs, but that we can capitalize it and we can be able to pay out direct cash assistance to people who really need it in our state. Moral of the story is that we have to start working for the people most impacted rather than working for the people who have the wealth, who, and as a result, have the political power to be able to sway legislation like this. And so we have to be pushing and not accept this argument that we don't have the money and where we're going to get the money. The money is there.
If I could
And I know
just
you wanted
also
to get in on
make
this.
2 points about, about wealth flight. So first of all, there's a data point here in Maryland that is kicked around a lot, and that even other states like New Jersey use when they're talking about when people are trying to push back against taxing the wealthy, where the number of millionaire returns in Maryland declined between, I believe it's 2008 and 2009. And the idea was we created a millionaire's tax at the top level of our income tax that was temporary. It's since gone away, and somehow this meant that millionaires were fleeing the state. And this gets used all the time. It's totally false. What happened is a number of millionaires, people who were making $1 million a year, made instead $900,000 a year. They were still in the state, they just weren't making $1 million because a lot of their income came from the stock market, and the stock market was down. Eventually, they made that money back. So that's the first point. So we have this report that came out many years ago from the comptroller that says we saw this drop. We can't raise taxes on the wealthy. Completely misinterpreting the data. The second point I would make is when we talk about corporate wealth, and specifically there's a policy called combined reporting, which is what I was talking about when I was talking about leveling the playing field for small local businesses versus big multi-state corporations. The argument here in Maryland and the other 20 states or so that don't have combined reporting has always been that, businesses will flee the state. Well, we have yet to implement it. We've heard this argument, and the legislature said, okay, we believe that argument and hasn't done it. And what happened? One of our largest companies here in Maryland, Discovery, moved to New York, which happens to be a state that has combined reporting. It wasn't the tax policy that drove the move. It was the fact that New York City is the largest media market in the world, maybe after Los Angeles, or I don't know where they rank. But anyway, the point is that businesses are not making their decisions based on tax policy. They're making their decisions based on other things like access to creative talent, or if they're in a really manufacturing intensive environment that has a lot of utility costs, what those utility costs are, or those sorts of things. Those are the major drivers of whether or not they have access to an educated workforce. Those are the drivers of their relocation decisions, not tax policy. At the end of the day, the average average American business pays, taxes make up less than 2% of the average business's overall expenses. So there's a lot of room for improvement here in Maryland and in many states across the country. But those are two very specific Maryland examples that I feel like are really important for those of us who are here in the state to know to push back against those talking points as we hear them among our neighbors.
Thank you. Next question. And this was already answered in the chat, but I'm going to restate it so that the answer can be given to everyone on the webinar. They can hear it out loud. So the question is, why are the phase outs in many of the federal proposals so high? $200,000 plus for a married couple. What would be a reasonable level for Maryland?
So I can start with what happened at the federal level. And one reason that those phase outs are so high is because it was based on 2018, 2019 filings, but COVID is changing the entire landscape, right? So there is some idea that we have no idea where people are now, and there's really nothing to tie it to, right? So either you go totally universal or you pick a number. And so that number was picked thinking a lot of middle income families would also be harmed. And this number goes across the country, right? So a $200,000 income in New York City or in DC or some parts of Maryland is very different, in other parts of the country. Ideally, a high phase out like that or a true UBI is going to be accompanied with progressive taxation. So the folks that don't actually need it, it's going to be clawed back, right? So we give it out to everybody. And then if you have wealth holdings, if you have a high income earning, then it's taken back because you don't need it. But I think that's why we had that high income. Also, I mean, let's be really clear. our government takes care of the middle class and the upper class in a way it doesn't take care of poor people. And so when we have folks fighting for these stimulus checks, they're fighting to maintain the idea that so many folks on this call have been talking about, of a nuclear family, of, you know, like this middle class lifestyle. They're not fighting for the most marginalized communities, right? And that's why we saw I-10 filers left out. So I think that that's it. We've often seen an ability to get folks money if they're in the middle or low middle, but scooping the folks that have really been left out up and in has been a lot harder. And this time we did. This is the first time we had a check go out if you had 0 earnings. Like, that's huge. That is enormous. And I think we need to hold on to that, and we need to keep fighting on this. Like, this is the first time 0 earnings. This isn't attached to your productive value in the labor market. This is, you need money to live.
Anybody else want to jump in on that question before I move to the next one? Thank you, Madeline, so much for resharing your answer.
One thing I'll say quickly is, as a general matter, it's important to emphasize that phase outs and taxes are sort of the same thing. It's just that phase outs are applied on the benefit side. And so as a matter of policy construction, it can be worth considering where, you know, for rich people, we're going to make the money up on the tax side. Hopefully, you know, in order to make the math work, you're going to have to do that. So it's worth asking yourself, where exactly do you want to, if you're going to use a phase out, where do you want to use it? If you use it in sort of lowish middle incomes, that causes a lot of problems because people might wind up on one side or the other of the line. They may not know where they are on the line. It can be a bit of an administrative hassle. I mean, I've seen this with food stamps so many times. That stuff starts phasing out relatively quickly, and you wind up with people who they're on food stamps 1 month, the next month their food stamps have been cut by $100. That's not the kind of experience you want to put on someone. So if anything, I'd say if you're going to phase it out, try to push the phase out further up the income ladder. Make those people deal with it. Don't make lower income people deal with the sort of math of where they are on the line, and then make it up on the tax side. That's a lot easier, better experience, especially for lower and middle.
Thank you. And I'm just going to wrap up because I think this next question really gets to the heart of what this whole webinar is for. How can people who want to support this effort be supportive? What can be done right now for them to support legislation in the future, or any of the other projects that you all are working on?
So,
Sorry, go on, Ben.
Go ahead.
So as I said, we have the Emergency Money to the People campaign that we're running right now. Use the hashtag money for the people, because after we were using money to the people, Andrew Yang tweeted it out once and changed everything. But get involved, call your legislators, put pressure to encourage ongoing, bigger, lasting payments from the federal government. So that's one thing that you can do. Our website, economicsecurityproject.org/emergency money will give you more information. And then I would encourage you to engage with your local leaders and get them on board. You already have one here in Maryland, but we need a lot more folks to be pushing this.
Ben?
And I would just add, so in the Maryland context, certainly follow Delegate Acevero on social media, but follow the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, join our mailing list. Our website is mdeconomy.org, and also follow the work of the Fair Funding Coalition that Nikki's leading, because these are the sorts of things that are going to make ideas like UBI possible. And really, you know, we're in a moment where we thought we'd made some progress and the governor has vetoed those bills. And so now the next 6 months is really about building a groundswell of support for overriding some of these vetoes that are preventing us from making progress on these issues, and on education, and also paying attention to what is happening at the governor's house, not just waiting for the legislature to come back in session in January. In Maryland, we have Our governor is the most powerful governor in the country in terms of state budget. He's the only person who can add money to the budget. Legislature can't.
Yep.
So the decisions that he makes right now in terms of what they're going to write into the next budget, and also the cuts that he proposes to the Board of Public Works, which can cut the budget when the legislature is not in session, are going to be super important. But we'll do our best to keep you informed if you follow us on social media or join our mailing list. Again, mdeconomy.org, and we'll throw that out there for the Maryland context specifically.
Anyone else have any other calls to action for everyone who's on the webinar?
I'll just add, just agree with what Matt said. Please continue to follow the work that the Maryland Center on Economic Policy and myself, along with organizations across our state, such as Advocates for Children and Youth, Organized Labor, Progressive Maryland, and others, fighting for direct cash assistance to low-income Marylanders, but certainly building out a universal basic income program here in our state. So please continue to follow that. We need your advocacy. We need your engagement at the state level, but we also need it at the federal level as well. As I mentioned earlier, I think we need a UBI program at the federal, the state, and at the local level, really, to help folks, because if we were to have what Andrew Yang was advocating for at the federal level, 1,000 at the federal level and 500 at the state level, what I'm advocating for, and let's say someone lived in Baltimore City, Montgomery County, or somewhere on the Eastern Shore, that their local jurisdiction then had a UBI program similar to Stockton Seed program, we're looking at upwards or over $1,500 that we could be providing in terms of assistance to people as a hand up, right? And those people will then in turn not just use that money to grow their earnings, but spending it back into their local economy and our state economy. And that ultimately is what we want, because as people earn more, they spend more. And so just continue to be engaged, follow, the work of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, the People's Policy Project, Democracy Collaborative, the Economic Security Project, doing a lot of great work to ensure that we're centering the voices and the concerns of working families, low-income people, and people who are intentionally marginalized by this economy. And I'll also add one quick point before I end. Ben mentioned about our governor being the strongest in the state. He absolutely is, as it relates to the budget. Thankfully, one of my bills that I put in it's a constitutional amendment. It will appear on your November ballot because it's a constitutional amendment. Basically what it does is it allows the state legislature to add, to restrict, and also to move funding around. Because as Ben mentioned, in order for us to respond to our constituents and to fund all these priorities, the state legislature needs to have a greater say in the budgetary process. We currently do not have one. And my bill, which thankfully passed before we adjourned, will be on the November ballot. So please vote for it, support it, so that your state legislature can have a say in the budgetary process. We can hold the governor accountable on state dollars, as we see right now. That's important more than ever. And we could get programs like universal basic income done.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. Also, thank you to all of you who joined the webinar, whether you joined on Zoom, whether you joined on Facebook Live. We're happy to have you. You've got a lot of tasks, a lot of things to look up, a lot to learn, but it's all going to be for great benefit, especially if we can see some of these ideas, especially UBI, come to fruition. So you can find out about future webinars by signing up for the Maryland Center on Economic Policy's email list at mdeconomy.org, or follow them on Twitter, the same tag. And if you are interested in all things revenue and how to make some of these ideas possible, you can follow the Maryland Fair Funding Coalition at Fair Funding MD, both on Twitter and on Facebook, or on on our website, which is fairfundingnd.org. Well, thanks again, everyone. We're going to close out. It was so great to chat with all of you today, to see your faces. Again, thanks, everyone. And I'm going to say goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.